Hello everybody and welcome to another video. So previously we've done videos looking at some of the consoles in my collection. We had a look at the Mega Drive and we had a look at the N64. So today I thought I'd do another video in that vein and actually look at Sega's follow-up to the Mega Drive, the Sega Saturn, and to showcase my collection of that. Now, the Saturn's quite a curious console. It was, like I say, it was Sega's follow-up to the Mega Drive. It was very highly anticipated at the time. Obviously, I was quite young at the time, so I don't necessarily remember all of that anticipation going into it, but I do remember the Saturn coming out. I remember seeing it around, some of the games around for it. I was actually going to get one at one point when my parents moved on from the Amiga. It was a tight kind of toss-up between the Saturn and the PlayStation, but they ended up opting for the PlayStation, which in the long term might seem like the better option, as it was the bigger console overall and had the bigger library. But I've always been intrigued by the Saturn, so a couple of years ago I did get one at the urging of a friend, and I've built up a little collection of games and also some curiosities that I do want to show. Now, in the previous videos I've kind of done loose cartridges and actual boxed games. Pretty much all my games for the Saturn are boxed except for a handful which are in dual cases and one which didn't come with a case, so I won't going to bother dividing it that way, but we're going to have a look at a few curiosities first. Now, the Sega Saturn came out in 1994. It was sort of the advent of 3D, the big push into 3D gaming. So it wasn't the first console to do 3D gaming, but it was that big push that games consoles were doing. So now we are going from 2D to 3D, and because of that, there were a number of really, really good 2D games that maybe suffered a little bit critically. There's a bit of pushback on that as reviewers and outlets really wanted to see the power of 3D games. Not only that, but the Saturn was kind of put out at a time when Sega was in a little bit of turmoil, which is kind of hard to understand because they had such a big success with the Mega Drive. But if you look into it, there was a lot of infighting and instability with the various branches of Sega. Not only that, it seemed a little bit confused as to what Sega's objective was, because they released the Saturn the same year as releasing the 32X add-on for the Mega Drive. So they were trying to prolong the life of the Mega Drive with this 32X console, which enhanced it greatly, but also put out the successor to the Mega Drive at the same time. And leading into that, you also had the oncoming of Sony's PlayStation and Nintendo's N64. Now, the N64 wouldn't arrive until a couple of years later, but the PlayStation would also arrive in 1994. There's a story that in order to get ahead of Sony with this, Sega went out at what was like the early version of E3. I don't think it was called E3 back then, but they came out and they went, the Sega Saturn is going to be available from tomorrow, catching a lot of people off guard, a lot of retailers off guard, ticking off a lot of them, and causing a lot of confusion in the marketplace. Whereas Sony went out and they released a simple statement, which was, I think it was $299. It was something like that. It might have been $199. I can't remember the exact figure, but that caused more of an uproar, and it sort of really swung things in Sony's favour back then. But that, it's not to say the Saturn was the worst performing console that would come out around that time. There were a lot of consoles released around then. We tend to think of that generation as being the Saturn, the PlayStation, and the N64, and certainly they were the top three, but you had Atari trying to sneak in there with the Jaguar. Commodore did the ill-fated Amiga CD32. You had the 3DO. They had various bits and pieces that dropped off the map, and whilst I think the Saturn was the worst performing of the three, certainly did not live up to the N64 PlayStation. It was a valiant effort, and it has some gems on there, which is why it's become a bit of a curiosity. So let's start and have a look at the first big curiosity. Now, this is something I bought kind of the same week I got the Saturn itself, and the first game on top of this stack will show you what it's useful for. This is the Sega Saturn 3D controller. Now, the normal controller is kind of an evolved version of the Mega Drive controller. You do not get this analog stick. Now, you might see some similarities to this with the Sega Dreamcast controller. Certainly, they would take this design and it would fold into the Dreamcast controller. Also, kind of would evolve into the Duke controller for the original Xbox. Of course, there were some ties between Sega and Microsoft on the Xbox, I believe. But this was useful for games like Nights into Dreams. So you've got the analog stick here, which allows for the better 3D movement in that game. You've got a D-pad and your 6 buttons, as well as some triggers on the back. It's not a bad little controller. It feels a little bit awkward at first, but it handles quite nicely. It fits to your hand quite well. I do quite like it, and it's like I say, it's an interesting little curiosity. One of the first controllers with an analog stick to hit the market. So yeah, I've shown that off. Let's have a look at the games themselves then. So I know I've just said we'll get into the games themselves, but one thing I did also purchase, which isn't so much a curiosity, but something I do own, it's Action Replay cartridge for the Saturn. So the interesting thing about this is it actually expands the internal memory of the Saturn. It doesn't really have too much on it, and it also runs off of I can't remember, it's CF2032 battery. This just it's a gives you a bit more memory to save your games onto. Also allows you to play imports, which this was recommended to me by a friend, and there are quite a few imports out there for the Saturn, and you can also get games cheaper if you import them than you can, especially certainly in the European market. So let's have a look at the games. So first up we have all the ones that are in dual cases. So I mentioned this earlier, Nights into Dreams. So I don't know why this one comes in a dual case and not a normal case. This is actually a European copy of it. First game I got, it's one of the first games I remember hearing about for the Saturn. It's an interesting game. It tells a story of two kids who enter like a nightmare world and take on the form of knights, which is this character on the front, and you have to traverse these stages, racking up points, flying through them, collecting gems, defeating enemies, racking up a certain number of points to unlock the next level. You get graded on it, and there's also boss fights in there. It's kind of hard to explain just offhand. It's very interesting. It is by Sonic Team. It's by the same guy who created Sonic. There's a lot of love for this game out there. It's certainly one that took me a while to get into, but I do really, really like it. So I definitely recommend giving that a go, and this is available on Steam as well, Nights into Dreams, with some modernised controls. There's also some modern re-releases for other platforms as well. Next up, these are all Japanese games. So first of all is a game called Necronomicon, which sounds ominous, doesn't it? This is a pinball game. I like my pinball games. One of my first games I ever played for the Amiga was Pinball Fantasies and Pinball Dreams, not Illusions. This is a really, really good pinball game. The main reason I got this and wanted it importing is because the soundtrack, some of the songs was done by John Petrucci of Dream Theater, who is one of my favourite guitarists. But this is a fine one. Good. I had to import this, like I say, because it's a Japanese-only release. Second up, now everyone knows how much I love Evangelion. You can probably see all the figures behind me, and obviously my name. This was sent to me by one of the viewers of the channel, one of my friends. This is Evangelion Second Impact. Second Impression, sorry, not Second Impact. And it's a visual novel sort of game. I haven't really had the chance to sit down and play this because it's all in Japanese and I don't understand Japanese. So I've never really had the chance to sit down and do it, but you get your main Sega Saturn disc there, but also, which I need to have a look at, you get a mini disc as well. So I need to actually have a look and see what's on there, as well as some cute little kind of art cards in here. So this is sort of a spin-off to the main Evangelion story. It introduces a new character, and it's sort of a date and simmy type game, with some tragedy thrown in there, because it wouldn't be Evangelion with a little bit of without a little bit of tragedy. Not the song by the Bee Gees, I might add. So yeah, I think there's English translations for that. There certainly is for a number of the Eva games, but I would need to try and find it and play through it, or find a translation guide. The final thing was recommended to me by the person who recommended I got the Saturn, which is Casey, my friend Casey. But this is like Yoshiyuki Sadamoto illustrations. He's the main sort of character artist for Evangelion. He initially created a lot of the character designs, but it's sort of disc of illustrations of his, featuring not just Evangelion, but a number of the things he had done up until the point this was released, which seems to be 1997. So yeah, that's quite an interesting sort of thing to own, I reckon. And finally, a loose game without a disc, without a proper case to call its home. But this is Die Hard Arcade, released in other places as, I think it's like Dynamite Cop or something like that, or Decker Cop or something like that. But this is loosely based on Die Hard. It was called something else in Japan. They don't have the Die Hard license there. This is a really, really good sort of 3D beat 'em up in the same vein as Streets of Rage. We played this on stream around Christmas back in 2022 and had a lot of fun. I managed to get to the boss of it and then died because the final boss. I'm not very good at 3D beat 'em ups, but I really enjoyed that. That is one that I would definitely recommend seeking out, although it can be quite pricey. That's why I've got it without the case, because with the case it goes for a lot more. Loose, it was a lot cheaper. Finally, two more little curiosities. I'm putting these in the curiosity pile and showing them off, even though these are reproduction copies. But we've got Police Notes, which is one of Hideo Kojima's very first games. It's sort of, again, visual novel, point-and-clicky type game. I really want to get around to playing this, just haven't had the time yet. Like I say, this is a reproduction copy. This is not legitimate, although the person who did it did a great job. But you will need a modded Sega Saturn to play this. And my reproduction copy of Panzer Dragoon Saga, which I showed off in the video for that. Again, you'd need a modded Sega Saturn to play this. I played this through the SD card mod that I've got for the Saturn. This is a fantastic game. I'm not going to say too much about it because I did make a video all about Panzer Dragoon Saga. But if you can, definitely check the game out. This goes for a ridiculous amount secondhand, legit. So you are probably going to have to emulate it or pirate it in some form, which I don't always like to recommend that method of doing things, but yeah, unfortunately it's one of those cases you'll have to, but this is brilliant. And again, the reproduction of it is really, really well made. Can't go wrong with it at all the discs are in there. So yeah, well done to them for that. So yeah, that's the little sort of your curiosities, dual case games. Let's have a look at the rest. So I don't have quite as many Saturn games as I do other collections, because I find the Saturn quite a difficult one to collect for. Some of the games can be quite pricey. But I do have a significant number, so let's start having a look at them. Now, the Sega Saturn games tended to come, especially in Europe, in cases like this. These are like a cardboardy plastic type case. I do not like them because, for one, the hinges seem to be a little bit sort of not great. But also, the discs inside tend to come out quite easily and rattle about. So some of these games come with manuals, some don't. Obviously, it depends on where you buy them from. But the first game on the list, Alien Trilogy. I had this for the PlayStation back in the day, and I think this is for anyone who grew up the same era I did, this has always been like a firm favourite of people. It's a first-person shooter that takes you across the 3 Alien games. Really atmospheric. I absolutely love this. I don't necessarily think it was massively loved at the time by critics. I don't know if people look back on it and enjoy it, but I really love this game, and I will always remember the cheat code for it to get you all the invincibility and levels and stuff. But I think it's one worth checking out, and it plays really well on the Saturn, actually. Next up, another firm favourite. Now, this one, I originally had both of these on the Amiga. I had a game that compiled both of these on the PlayStation, and I think it's just two arcade classic games that I think everyone needs to play and should own. You've got Bubble Bobble on here, also featuring Rainbow Island. So Bubble Bobble, you play as these two dinosaurs, Bub and Bob, on these single screen levels. You progress further and further down, but what you do, you're charged with getting rid of all the enemies by blowing bubbles at them and jumping on the bubbles and getting rid of them. It's a really fun and addictive arcade game, and it's also 2-player, which is really cool. Rainbow Islands is sort of a sequel to it, but doesn't play the same. Again, it's like, I think it is 2-player, but you play as this kid who can throw rainbows out. You use it to traverse further and further up levels and get through these various lands. I've never completed either of these games, but I've gotten really far in both of them. But they are so much fun. No matter what system you have, I would definitely recommend seeking out a version of them because they're brilliant. They're some of the best pure arcade games you can ever play. Next up is a game that I think is a absolute Saturn classic. Most people talk about it. It's also an arcade classic. It's Daytona USA, and I've left a sticker on. You can see that I bought this for £9 at CEX. Daytona is it's a really fun racing game. It's one of those must-have Saturn games. I'm rubbish at it, I will admit, but it is really fun. And it's got this really quirky soundtrack to it, which I think anyone who had this game will probably remember, but definitely worth checking out. Next up, we have Digital Pinball. This is like called Last Judgment or something like that. This is really, really good, and this is the prequel to that Necronomicon game that I shown earlier. It's a pinball game, so you know what to expect here. The tables are good, the pinball action itself is really fun. This was a bit of a hard one. I think I had to import this as well, but it was kind of a hard one to get hold of, so... And there are plenty of pinball games out there, but if you want pinball on your Saturn, can't necessarily go wrong with it. Next up is one I have not played yet, but it's one I'm kind of saving maybe for like when I've got a few days off. Terry Pratchett's Discworld. This is one of many point-and-click games made based on the Discworld franchise. And it's got like a good voice cast in there. Like I say, I've not played this yet. It's one I've been saving for kind of like when I've got a few days off, I can just sort of absorb myself into it. But I've heard very good things about this, although I have heard some of the puzzles can be a little bit obtuse at times. Like a lot of games made like point and clicks made in the early 90s could be. But yeah, I've heard very good things about this, can't wait to check it out. I do have Discworld 2 for the PlayStation, and I have Discworld Noir somewhere for the PC. Next up, Mech Warrior 2. So, console port of Mech Warrior 2. You play as a mech, you go through stages. I played a little bit of this. It is really fun. Kind of a little bit hard to control. It's certainly not like Mech Warrior 5 is for the Mon platforms, which is a game I would definitely recommend checking out. But it's cool. It's really, really cool to kind of get this sort of gameplay on there. I don't necessarily think the Saturn version of this is the definitive version. People would probably point to the PC or maybe the PlayStation. But yeah, this is really worth checking out. Although it did cost me a fair bit. I think it was like £30-40 for that. We have two Saturn must-haves now. Panzer Dragoon, which is obviously the prequel to Panzer Dragoon Saga. It's an on-rail shooter where you're on the back of a dragon, going through various stages, taking out enemies. It is really difficult in places. I don't think I've ever managed to get past the third level on the Saturn version. The Switch version, like there's a Panzer Dragoon HD remake. I think they made it a little bit easier, so I've been able to progress in that. You're also hindered by the fact that you have limited lives and continues on this. But it's very good, very atmospheric. It's one of those must-have games for the Saturn. And of course, that's followed by Panzer Dragoon 2, the sequel. This was put into production the same time as Panzer Dragoon Saga. This plays exactly the same as Panzer Dragoon. You're on the back of the dragon. I think they made this one a little bit easier because there were complaints about the difficulties in the first one. So, but yeah, I don't know how easy this one is to get hold of nowadays, and there was word that they were going to make a remake of this one, but I don't know what the status is of that. It seems to have fallen by the wayside a little bit over the last few years. So, kind of stuck on the Saturn for now, for the moment. Next up, another must-have racing game, Sega Rally Championship. This was featured quite heavily in arcades at the time and ported to the Saturn. The Saturn port is quite decent. Again, I'm terrible at it. I'm really bad at it. I don't think I've managed to really do too well, but it's a fun rally game of the era. Obviously, many games have probably came out that have surpassed this in terms of, you know, how deep a rally game can go, but this is very pick up and play, which is never a bad thing. Now, the Saturn, curiously, did not get its own Sonic game. There was one meant to be released. It was called like Sonic Extreme or something, and there were previews of it, and there is like a demo lurking out there, but it never came out. The Saturn would go out without its own Sonic game, which seems like a crime. Obviously, the Dreamcast would get Sonic Adventure, but you did get Sonic game on the Saturn. You got Sonic Jam, which, well, I think you also got a part of Sonic 3D. But Sonic Jam was all of the Sonic games released for the Mega Drive, all the 2D ones. So you got Sonic, Sonic 2, Sonic 3, Sonic and Knuckles. all ported to the Saturn. You got a few additional bells and whistles here and there. I think they packed in like an easy mode for it, but it's Sonic the Hedgehog. You know what you're getting with this. I think if you get a Saturn, you probably should pick this up if you haven't already picked up what the Sonic games in their various re-released forms. Obviously, I had to get this because I love me some Sonic the Hedgehog. And I didn't have a working Mega Drive at the time, so having the originals on hand to play on that platform was worth doing. Next up is a game I had for the PlayStation again. This is Soviet Strike. I spoke about the Strike series in my Mega Drive video. This is one that I keenly remember playing and getting very far on for the PlayStation. Interestingly, it comes in a different type of box. So did Sonic Jam. This is more of what I would call a... what I remember video cassettes coming in back in the day. But it's very similar. It's very plasticky. You get a big manual in there. Like I say, it's very much like a VHS thing, but EA back in these days kind of were a little bit, did their own thing. You might have noticed in the Mega Drive video that all of their cartridges had that yellow tab on. I'm not sure why or what that was meant to signify, if anything at all, just that this was an EA game. But Soviet Strike is well worth checking out. I really, really like this one. It plays like any of the other Strike games. It can be quite tough. Certainly the first level in this, I remember you have to be very quick to get over to the first objective to take out enemies before they took out the targets. Otherwise, you failed the mission pretty instantly. Now, another game kind of the era, you had a lot of games like this coming out for different platforms. It's a steep slope sliders. I have difficulty saying that. It's a snowboarding game. I've played this a handful of times. It's not bad. I'm not really into my snowboarding games as it is, but this was decent. It looks quite poor for the time. It's very, very blocky. I think games for the PlayStation, like Cool Borders and probably 1080 snowboarding on the N64, classed as better games. But if you want some snowboarding action on the Saturn, this is one for you. Next up, I did not know this one got a Saturn port before I found it in a shop. Theme Park. Theme Park originally released on a number of platforms before this and released on the PlayStation. I think PC and Amiga are probably the definitive versions of it, but the Saturn port is quite decent as well. This is a management game. You're charged with owning and operating a theme park. It's by Bullfrog, so you know there's going to be a little bit of quirky humour in there. You know it's going to be quite decent because Bullfrog were a fantastic developer. It's not as complex as a game like Roller Coaster Tycoon was, which would come out several years later, but it's still a fine game in its own right and certainly worth checking out. You've got a number of different rides in there that you can operate. You can build your own roller coasters. Again, certainly not as deep as Roller Coaster Tycoon was, but this has certainly got a pick up and play kind of aesthetic to it, and I really love Theme Park. Many, many hours spent on this back in the day, both on the PC version and the PlayStation versions. And the Saturn, it plays really well on the Saturn, surprisingly enough. And finally, we come to Virtua Fighter 2. Generally heralded as one of the best fighting games ever made, not just of this era, but ever made. Virtua Fighter is a very deep and technical fighting game, which means, as with most fighting games, I'm terrible at it. I do remember playing a Virtua Fighter in the well, not in the arcade, but when we go to the pub, they have an arcade machine. And it is very, very fun. I always get to a certain point in it and kind of, end up losing a lot and not being able to progress. But if you like your fighting games, this is always said to be one that is definitely worth picking up. I don't know too much about the Virtua Fighter series outside of that. I know they tend to be seen as a bit more technical and maybe more hardcore. Certainly don't get their, chance in the spotlight like, say, Tekken or Street Fighter has done. But I know there's a lot of love out there for the series. And there you have it. That's your sort of run through my Saturn collection. So do let me know in the comments if you had a Saturn yourself, any memories you have of the system, any games you loved for it. If you are intrigued by the Saturn now, based off of this video, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts of a system that I think didn't really do as well as maybe it deserved to do, but you can kind of see the reasons why when you look at the era it was released in. It's certainly one that I think is worth checking out and maybe is classed as a little bit underrated. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this, and I shall see you again in a future video. Goodbye.